slide, Dr. Bill, when you're ready.
All right, sounds good. All right, so we're still going back. We'll kind of go get, first of all, I'll try to speak slower. I'm not a very good slow talker, sorry. So I'll try to slow down for everybody so we all stay on the same page. I really do appreciate the different languages that are here. It's really awesome to speak to a really diverse audience from around Asia and the other side of the world relative to my experience in North America. So thank you again for coming.
Just pretend you're from Alabama.
Yeah, my wife's from Alabama, so I can't make too many jokes or she'll be upset with me. So, kind of going back to this analogy of managing growth, we're doing it through this car analogy, where we're kind of picking the gear. And again, unfortunately, the gear or the clutch is something in the turf industry we don't have that much control over. And so I want to just kind of wrap this up by talking a little bit about some of our research and trying to understand how temperature is impacting the growth rate of our grass. And I think it's a pretty complex part of it, because what we're observing is the temperature related to making sugar isn't always as directly tied to the temperature that's best for the grass to grow or how it responds to fertilizer. And so I think that's where we'll spend a little bit of time wrapping up, is talking about the temperature clutch. And again, it's something, I have a picture of a clutch here, not like we can shift gears. We can't change our temperatures easily to go from it to being hotter or cooler. But at least being aware of what the temperature is doing to how we respond to fertilizer applications is going to be important when we start thinking about the accelerator and how do we try to manage our clipping yields with nitrogen fertilizer. So a lot of this research really started to come to the forefront again with Micah and Larry talking about the growth potential models to try to predict, what was the potential for that grass to grow based on temperatures. And so if you look at these two different curves here, you can kind of see that the warm season grass and the cool season grasses kind of have an optimum potential to grow. And again, this is holding all other factors constant. So we're holding moisture constant. And if we're holding nutrition and everything else constant, what would the growth be if it was just a result of temperature? And so I think this is really helpful, because you look at the research, these two peaks really line up really well with temperatures at which the grass is most efficient at making sugar, making energy, storing energy. And so, the idea here is it's more of an estimate on sugar production, and we're seeing that maybe not always directly tied to growth rate. And so this is kind of, we look at these curves and we plot them over different environments. This is from Micah. Micah's slide here, he's plotting growth curve of, say, Dallas, Texas in the U.S., and we can see how it showed the cool season grasses would be able to make more sugar in the middle of in the spring and in the fall when it's cooler outside in Dallas, and then when it's really hot, it's really conducive for making sugar for Dallas or for the warm season grasses, but not as much for the cool season grasses. And I've been saying making sugar instead of just saying growth. And I think when we talk about growth, we have to be more precise in the language of growth. Growth could be root growth, it could be making sugar, it could be storing sugar, it could be clipping yield elongation, it could be tillers or the amount of leaves per area. Those are all going to be factors of growth. So when I'm talking about growth here, I'm talking about an elongation growth, what would actually be in our clipping yield in our bucket. So we looked at some research to kind of try to evaluate these curves. And so this is some research that was done at Mississippi State. There's a guy here named Ethan, and what he did is he grew different grass species, warm season and cool season, in these different chambers in which they could keep all factors the same, except for they had different levels of temperature in these different chambers. And so when they looked at this research, for Bermuda grass, they found that the peak amount of growth rate was around 30 to 35 degrees Celsius, obviously. So for that species, that's when they had the highest level of growth. As it started to get warmer, it actually started to maybe trend down. It got even a little bit hot. The thing to think about, though, and Mike and I were talking about this yesterday, is to remember these are short-term studies. And so, again, it's that disconnect of this is clipping yield, and how does that relate to the plant's ability to make sugar based on some classical type of research. And for the warm season grasses, they really seem to be over the top of each other. We're seeing peak ability of clipping yield is happening at about 30 degrees C, which is pretty similar to what we would expect for making sugar. So that's good. The more sugar you make, the more the grass grows, and so that's a nice kind of thing to look at. When it comes to the cool season grasses, though, in the field, we observe some different things that would be maybe atypical of the growth rate and the sugar assimilation or the production of sugar based on what we're actually seeing on growth rate. So this is on a cool season tall fescue in Nebraska. And in Nebraska, it gets pretty darn warm in the summer, but then it gets very cold in the winter. So we have very warm summers, cold winters. I like that figure that Mike had presented on Twitter showing, like, you know, locations based on if they have high winters, high summers, and like we're definitely this place that it's, you know, you get both worlds, which I enjoy, to have the cold and the hot. So you would anticipate that you'd see a big growth surge on a cool season grass in Nebraska in May and into June, when the weather is really conducive for making sugar. But when we look at our actual clipping yields from the field, we see there's this big dip. And we see this in all of our research studies as we start looking at all the different sites. And then when it's really hot outside, when temperatures are, you know, 30, 35, 40 degrees for highs, when we know our plants are not making much sugar, we're seeing this big spike in growth rate. What's going on here? This is a release of fertilizer. The release of nitrogen fertilizer in the soil is stimulating that gibberellin hormone again. So now we're making the hormone to elongate, but we're not making sugar to support that level of growth. And so all of a sudden now we're having problems. And so when we look at some of those growth chamber studies like this, which are over a course of a couple months, maybe you can make a curve. But when you look at it for maybe a whole season, if it stayed really hot, if it stayed like this for Nebraska, and we had bentgrass or any other cool season species, over time it's going to die, right? We all know that, right? So there's a disconnect that we're seeing with some of these cool season species. So I kind of wanted to do some more research on this, so we took it to a greenhouse. And again, the important thing here is to not even worry about the species or the curve, but just notice what happens. So what we're doing here is we have different growth chambers, and we have different temperatures, from 7 degrees C for an average temperature all the way up to 35 degrees. And then we have either fertilized with an 1/8 of a pound or a 1/2 of a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. And so what we'll notice for the perennial ryegrass cool season is that the peak temperature for the kind of the best was about between 15 and 20 degrees. Again, that's right in line with kind of what Micah's growth potential model was showing. But notice the difference in kind of the response to fertilizer. So if I use a higher rate of fertilizer, I see a much greater response, and we're in an optimal environment temperature. And then when it gets really hot, we notice that things really quickly go to a point. And when it's 35 degrees for an average, perennial ryegrass doesn't grow. It's just pretty much dead. I mean, it's not dead. It's still alive at this point, but there's no leaf elongation. There's nothing to measure. But then we go to a grass like bentgrass, putting greens. It's kind of its own weird little grass. The ryegrass really looks like the growth potential models from PACE and from ATC. So we go to the bentgrass. What do we see? It's a little bit different. We continue to see an increase in the point at which we start to see an increase in growth rate up to like 25 degrees C at a lower rate. It's about 20 degrees C at a higher rate. And at no fertilizer, we saw our peak at about 30 degrees C. So it seems to be starting to move a little bit. And again, this is representing that disconnect between the plants making sugar at about 20 degrees. It's optimizing there. But we're continuing to see an increase in clipping yield response to fertilizer at these higher and higher rates of fertilizer at higher and higher temperatures. So you got to think, you know, is that a problem? Well, it could be, because now, again, we're making sugar faster or slower than when they were growing, and that could lead to some types of problems. So if, again, we're thinking about our car analogy here, this would be a case where if we're trying to increase our clipping yields, say the grass is not growing fast enough for whatever our clipping yield we need for our course. If I had a cool season grass like bentgrass, or if you have a warm season grass like most of you do for Bermuda grass, if the temperatures are outside these ideal ranges, In order to get a big increase in clipping yield, you might need a lot more fertilizer to get the same level of increase. So your responsiveness to fertilizer is going to be less when you're outside of those ideal temperature windows. So we're trying to apply this now. We can use some of that as kind of like our gear. So if it's really cold outside, if we think about the clutch, we're probably in first gear for our Bermuda grass. I could put down a whole bunch of fertilizer, and I'm not going to see much of a response from it because I'm not in a gear in my car that's fast enough to really see a big growth surge. And as a result, I'm going to lose a lot out the bottom. I'm going to leach it. It's going to go out and through the rainfall events. It's going to be inefficient. So we don't want to put a lot of fertilizer down when we're not kind of in a growth potential to maximize our growth. So let's just say now let's kind of avoid growth potential and assume we're in the middle of the season and we are growing grass and nice and vigorously. Conditions are pretty favorable to maintain Bermuda grass. How do we maintain our fertility to really try to dial in our clipping yield when all the other factors are pretty stable? So like I said, nitrogen application rate drives growth elongation. Okay? It drives GA production. And here's another example of that. It's another study from Wayne Cousseau at Wisconsin in the 90s. And again, it really shows how responsive the production of this GA hormone is to nitrogen fertilizer. So we're going from 0 to 16 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, which is about 4 times what most high-end courses are probably putting on their greens. We continue to see an increase in growth rate. Growth rate just keeps climbing. The more N I put down, the faster my growth rate's going to be, because you're making more and more of that GA, gibberellin hormone. If you don't have that much fertilizer there, we have less of that hormone, and so we see slower growth rate. This is problematic, though. If it's really hot and I'm growing a cool season grass and I'm still seeing a lot of growth up at these really high rates, over the course of a 6 or 8 or 12-month growing season, eventually you're going to run out of sugar because the grass cannot sustain that level of growth. It runs out of sugar and it starves to death and it dies and it collapses. And so that's kind of an important thing to think about when trying to figure out, what's an ideal level of growth. But for the most part, we're always way down here. This is kind of where most golf course managers are, depending on their season and their species. Between 0 and 6 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000, which is about 280 kilograms per hectare, would be somewhere around there. So we're thinking about nitrogen fertilizer. If everything was perfect, we constantly would have organic nitrogen. Microbes would make it available and become mineral nitrogen. Plants would take that up, and it would just circle around forever. But we do lose some out the bottom. We can lose some up to the atmosphere. But a big chunk of our removal is right here, aeration and clipping yield. The more N that we have in those buckets, and also when we're core aerifying, we're taking thatch away, that thatch and those clippings, they have nutrients in them. They have nitrogen in them. So the more growth we have, the more we're taking the nutrients away faster, the more our bank account and our soils get depleted and go lower and lower and lower. And I showed that in a slide before, where we fertilized at 6 pounds of N, the soil test levels went down a lot, versus at 2 pounds of N, they went down a little. So we have to fertilize to try to replace what we're losing, mainly to clipping yield losses. So here's an example to show how plant growth regulators, by reducing clipping yield, actually reduce nitrogen and nutrient requirements. Because if I have this putting green here, and this is again creeping bentgrass, no primo, 4/10 of a pound every month, had the exact same quality as 2/10 of a pound of a month with primo. And why is that? Well, the plant growth regulators increase the color slightly. They can increase the density. So that's one factor. The other factor is you're removing less nutrients. And so more can sit in that soil system and supply the turf at later times. The organic matter is also a great, huge pool of nitrogen fertilizer, and this can make nitrogen fertilization more challenging. Here's some research from Roch Goswami looking at the increase in organic matter over time. So we got a 1-year-old green, not much organic matter. Then 2, 3, 4, 8 years, now we have all this organic matter here. And we think about what this being bad, right? Oh, I don't want this organic matter. I have to aerate more. I have to top dress more. Grass is constantly pumping carbon, is constantly pumping organic matter into our soils. It's going to happen. We can try to dilute it. We can try to remove it. We can try to do those things with our cultivation, but it's going to happen. But just think about that. That's not just carbon. That's nitrogen also that's bound up. So this is a slide from Doug Soldat at Wisconsin. If we have a brand new green, and at year 1, there's 0% organic matter, and at year 10, there's 1% organic matter, you might think 1% organic matter, no big deal. That's pretty low. That's not a lot. But then you remember that soil is extremely heavy. And so 1% of 10,000 kilograms per hectare is a lot, actually. So if we assume that 5% of those 10,000 kilograms of soil are that organic matter, or if the organic matter is nitrogen, that means we have about 500 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare in our soil, just from that one measly percent of organic matter. So to get there over these 10 years, from 1 to 10, that means every pound per thousand or every 50 kilograms per hectare that I put on my turf, one of it went just to organic matter, and it really isn't, and that's what it's being accounted for. It's being tied up in the soil. And so when you have a new soil, you need more nitrogen than, say, an older soil. If you have an old green, 3% organic matter, using those same assumptions, that would be 1,500 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen. If we assume only 3% of that 1,500 kilograms become mineralized and the microbes break them down so they can feed the plant, that's a pound per thousand. That's 50 kilograms per hectare that's being applied just from the soil. So an old soil doesn't need as much fertilizer to get the same level of response. So thinking about that, which way are your soils headed? Here's another study that was done, kind of a classic, Starr and DeRue, 1981. They put down 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, and then they just tracked where did it go. Of the 4 pounds that they applied, 3 pounds were taken up by the plant. Of the 3 that were taken up, 1 came from the 4 pounds that they applied directly. 1 pound came from clippings, recycling nutrients, and the other pound that was taken up came from soil from prior year's fertilization. So think about that. When you're fertilizing, you're not just fertilizing for this instant in time, but you're going to have profound effects on the performance of the turf through history too, as that fertilizer is constantly being cycled in the soil system. Here's an example of that. 2015 PGA Championship was at Whistling Straits. Before the tournament, it was a cool, dry year in Wisconsin. The grass didn't look very good. It was kind of yellow, wasn't growing very vigorously. The managers were thinking, maybe I should put down some urea, some quick-release fertilizer to get a little bit more color response going to the tournament. They decided they weren't going to do that, and the Friday before the tournament, they got 3/4 of an inch of rain. And that grass greened up like crazy, and it just exploded out of the ground. The changes in the environmental conditions favored the release of nitrogen fertilizer from the soil, and now they were growing so much grass that they could not control it, right? In that situation, what do you do? If you're driving down the road and your car is racing down a hill, what do? You hit the brakes. So we use that same kind of concept in about 5 minutes, talk about how they could use PGRs for that. But this is really just accounting for thinking about we don't have a lot of control in the availability of nitrogen. The soil is a huge factor, and all we're kind of do is just sprinkling a little nitrogen fertilizer on the top to try to even our growth rates the best that we possibly can. So what do I like to do? I like to do soluble sources frequently. I avoid applications when the grass is growing slow and growth potential is minimal, for when it's too cold outside. And I try to collect some data. There's different technologies out there that we can use to collect the data and just write it down. One thing that I've really enjoyed doing on my research plots is I build these little calibration test strips where I'll put down fertilizer at different levels, small little spots on a fairway or on a green. And then I'll figure out, okay, maybe I like this level of green. And then I can look at my little sheet of paper and say, it took X amount of fertilizer to make the grass look that green. So instead of just always putting down the same level of fertilizer every single week, I'm now using some data to say, okay, maybe I'm under-fertilizing or I'm over-fertilizing to get the quality that I need. This might be hard to do. I can attest to that. We have hand little sprayers that I can spray little squares. But I think with GPS sprayer technology, it could be a lot easier. And we're really seeing this technology taking off. It's really saving people a lot of money in pesticides. But if you can just be driving along on your fairway, and then all of a sudden, it's automatically changing the fertility to make little squares of low, medium, and high levels of nitrogen, now they can automatically do it for us. And then all we have to do is come back a week later and look at it and go, I want that one. I want to put that much fertilizer down. So I think that can be helpful. So if you're collecting data like this, just plot it up. Jason Haynes is in Canada doing a lot of cool stuff of plotting his data. But you can just do this in Excel. This is an example where I would plot the turf quality over the course of a summer, and then I plotted my fertility on top of it. At the end of the year, I can look back and go, what happened here when my quality went low? Can I put some more fertilizer there? Or maybe the growth potential from my clutch was just not ideal to maximize my clipping yield. Middle of the summer, my quality was too good maybe. It was just too green. People didn't like it. It looked too lush out there. So I'll need to maybe put down less fertilizer at that time of year to maintain that quality. If we have the data, then we can really start to become smarter and really assessing and evaluating how we fertilize and maintain the quality that we need. But there's some times, like you had at Whistling Straits, where that grass is just growing like crazy, and we just can't do anything about it. So then what do? We go into our bag of tricks, and we pull out our plant growth regulator. If nitrogen fertilizer in our clutch are going to determine how much GA can be produced or is being produced, my brake pedal is my PGR. Can I use the PGR then to shut down that growth rate so that I can get the growth where I need it to be instead of having it run away? The biggest challenge with using a PGR by far is knowing when they're working. This is actual clipping yield in dry weights, so how much weight is in my clipping yield buckets, of plots that are black lines that never were treated with Primo on a putting green versus plots on the red line that were treated with Primo. Primo was applied every 4 weeks in this example. So what do we notice? We see there's a couple days here we applied and we have the black line is higher than the red line. This is called clipping yield suppression. I've used the PGR to slow down my clipping yield, to push the brake. If you don't apply it frequently enough though, you start to see what's called a rebound. The grass is actually now growing a little bit faster. And then it slows down again when we reapply. Now the red dots are below. But the thing to me that's the most obvious of this graph is not what the PGR is doing, because that's a pretty small effect on a putting green. It's the day-to-day fluctuations. This is all those environmental factors we cannot control that are causing my clipping yields to go all over the place from day to day. So it's really hard for us to evaluate if these plant growth regulators are working. If I wanted to, say, try a PGR for the first time, and I applied it, say, here, okay, in early July, and then my clipping yield skyrocketed for 2 weeks, you'd say that PGR sucks. I'm not going to use it anymore, right? If you put the PGR, though, here in mid-July, and in the next 2 weeks, clipping yield slowed down for no apparent reason, but you just saw clipping yield reduction, you'd think that PGR did the job, and I like it, right? That's what you're going to think. But if you had a control there, you would just know that it had nothing to do with the PGR. It was all because the weather had changed, the climate had changed, the environment had changed, the clutch, the gear on the car shifted, and so we don't see the growth response anymore. So when you put down our PGRs, this is relative clipping yield. Instead of thinking about the actual weight, what we do is we focus on, is the red line above the black line or below the black line? So we plot things as relative clipping yield. So if it's below this dashed line, which is how fast the non-treated is growing, it's in yield suppression. If it's above it, we're seeing a yield rebound. When you put down a PGR, we see this a period of clipping yield suppression, maybe about 2 weeks. And then after that, the PGR is gone, it's worn off, it's been mowed off, or the plant broke it down. And then all the energy that was stored here in the GA hormone that got blocked, that river got dammed, we get rid of the dam, and then all of a sudden we see a huge surge in growth rate as a result of it, because the GA now is made into this form, and the grass is growing like crazy. I thought it was kind of like this, where you'd see 2 weeks suppression, 2 weeks rebound. In actuality, it's continuous. You put down the PGR at day 0. At 1 week, we had maximum amount of clipping yield suppression. It wore off. At 2 weeks, at 3 weeks, we had the peak rebound. And at 4 weeks, it is worn off and it's gone. So from this, when do you think you guys would want to apply your PGR? Anyone want to throw in a guess? How many days? 7 days? That would be a good, reasonable number. We could even go a little bit longer. We can usually go up to about 10 days to save yourself a little bit more money. The problem is, even with this is wrong. So the research shows that in the summertime, as it gets hotter outside, the PGRs break down faster. So the hotter it is outside, the shorter they last. It's really important. If it's cold outside, they last a long amount of time. If it's hot out, they last a short amount of time. So as a result, the curves change. So when it's really hot, you can see this red line. In this example, the suppression phase was a week, the rebound phase was a week, and then it was done. When it was cold outside for a cool season grass, they had 3 weeks, and then they had 3 weeks of rebound. So just going out with a PGR every 2 weeks, or a week, or 3 weeks is just really inefficient because the weather's changing. And maybe now it's changing much in Thailand, where it's probably a lot more constant than it would be in Nebraska. But just focusing on that, you can start to realize that we can use some of these concepts of growing degree days to start to dial in to account for these differences in response. So our goals are maintain clipping yield suppression. We get a lot of plant health benefits from maintaining some level of PGR suppression, but avoid too much suppression. You don't want to be riding down the highway in your car with 1 foot on the gas and 1 foot on the brakes, right? That's not the goal of driving a car. So let's try to use that concept towards scheduling our PGRs. So one way that we can start to understand the differences in how long a PGR is going to last is apply this concept of growing degree days, in which we're taking the average temperature and we're adding it together until we get some kind of a magical growing degree day threshold. And when we cross the threshold, we then reapply the PGR. So if it's cold outside, it takes a long time for that to happen. And if it's really hot outside, it takes a really short amount of time. So to do it by hand, it's pretty simple. You take yesterday's temperature, and since I'm assuming everybody in here is a warm season manager, not a cool season manager, you subtract off 10. That's the base temperature. And then you add them all together. So if you applied today, and the average temperature was 25 degrees C today, I take off 10 for the base, which is then 15. Then I start adding all those temperatures together. So if today was 15 and tomorrow was 20, then I'm at 35. And if I had 15 the next day, 35 plus 15 is 50. And you just keep going until you hit a threshold of, say, 200. Then you have to reapply the PGR because you know it's been mowed off or it's gone. So you can do it by hand. We also have a tool out there, greenkeeperapp.com. I have some handouts for it. If you're interested in this research, you grab the handout and I'll be happy to give it to you. I'll show it in a second. So we built these growing degree day models for the turf. It's pretty simple. You apply the PGR to the turf. You collect the clippings. We're at 47,000 clipping samples now in the last 10 years to do all these models. And then we just try to fit them to the weather data. So we first started this on bentgrass greens. I'm going to show this again, assuming no one here has bentgrass greens. But just the concepts hold true to Bermuda grass. So just bear with me here to show the concept. So if we applied every 4 weeks, we had suppression, rebound. We reapplied, we had suppression, clipping yield, rebound. It didn't work. We didn't maintain clipping yield suppression. So then we tried some different thresholds. We tried 800 growing degree days Celsius. Well, this is a base 0, again, because this is a cool season species. But again, suppression, rebound, suppression, rebound. It's not maintaining suppression. We're not getting plant health benefits. You'd be better off not even using the PGR. So instead of having cumulative clipping yield here, or having days on the bottom, we have cumulative growing degree days. So how many growing degree days have occurred since we first applied the product? So if we apply the PGR at time 0, what we notice is we'd have a period of growth suppression and then a rebound. And from our research, we'd say if we applied at 230 growing degree days, we should therefore be able to maintain clipping yield suppression. So we had a treatment that we actually tested that. And so when we did it in Wisconsin the first time, we were able to maintain clipping yield levels at or below the level of the non-treated control. We blocked that GA pathway the entire season long. You might think, though, what about different rates? You know, if you look at a label will say if you double the application rate, you should get longer levels of control. So we wanted to test that. So we applied every 4 weeks at a low rate and a double of the labeled rate. And we found that we had the same suppression, rebound phases happening despite going at higher rates. So that was kind of weird. You know, you assume if you go at a higher rate, it's going to last longer, but it's not. What's going on here? The University of Minnesota said, okay, if rate's not important, let's go at a lower rate. And what did they find? They tested the normal label rate and then versions of the lower rate of Primo on bent POA greens. They found the exact same interval still, even though they've used lower rates. But now they found that the amount of growth suppression, how hard you pushed on the brake, was less with lower rates. It was the first time we started to see that application rate impacts how much suppression we have, how much reduction in clipping yield, how hard we push that brake, and not really how long it lasts. One thing we noticed, though, if we double the reapplication frequency, so instead of applying at 200 growing degree days, we applied at 100 growing degree days. And we're thinking, what's going on here? What we noticed was instead of having 20% less growth, now we had 30 to 35% less growth. So by going at a tighter interval, we actually had the same effect as going at a higher rate. And the reason is because of this idea of half-lives. We'll talk about that more in a second, so I'll skip over this for now. But it has something to do with, it's very similar to what happens when we drink a little bit too much whiskey. And I'll explain that in a second. So just keep that in mind. We then also started looking at other PGRs, and we found the very similar types of relationships. If we use the low rate of Trimit, a PGR, and we use the high rate, which is 3 times greater than the low rate, the amount of clipping yield suppression goes from only 31% to 53%. I reduced half of my clipping yield at that high rate versus a third of my clipping yield at the low rate. But my intervals went from 270 to 310 growing degree days. On an average summer, that's a day to 2 more days control for 3 times the amount of product. I mean, that's just a waste of money. If you don't need that much growth suppression, then you go at the low rate because the interval didn't really change much. So we looked at all the PGRs, we found that. Going from the low to high rate, we increased the amount of suppression, we increased how hard we're pushing the brake, but we didn't increase we didn't really change the application interval in growing degree days. So they're separate from each other. So stop thinking about application rate along with how long it lasts. It doesn't. How long it lasts is dependent on mowing height and temperature. Application rate impacts how much suppression we get. We looked at then Bermuda grass and bent grass fairways, and we found that on bent grass fairways, again, same thing now. Instead of going at the higher rate, we see the same thing. Higher levels of clipping yield suppression. Intervals didn't really change, but now instead of an interval being 200 growing degree days, it's 350. So it's lasting almost double as long on a fairway as it is on a green. Why is this? Well, because bent grass fairways and collars are growing half as fast nearly as the green is. So you're mowing it off slower. So if you're out applying PGRs to your Bermuda grass greens and you have collars that maybe are a different species or even just Bermuda grass at a higher mowing height, all of a sudden now you're spraying too frequently on those collars and we start to see some collar decline issues. So our intervals now, instead of being like 200 to 300 growing degree days for greens, on a bent grass fairway it's like 300 to 600. And the amount of suppression, too, goes from 50%, from 30 to 50% on a green. Now we're getting 50 to 80 to 90% clipping yield suppression because of how we're applying the product. So how about ultra dwarfs? You're saying, Bill, nobody cares about bentgrass. Stop talking about bentgrass. The same concepts are found to be occurring on our Bermuda grasses. That's why I still talk about them. This was developed now in the southeast part at 4 universities in the southeast part of the United States over the last 2 years. And we looked at our models, and we found that the models still were created very, very easily. They still worked out. We still find the same thing. Higher application rate leads to more suppression. It doesn't change how long the PGRs last. The only thing that's kind of interesting is we don't see a rebound. So the grass just kind of slowly resumes normal growth rate. It doesn't have that big surge in growth that we see for the Bermuda grass. So if we use a base 10 instead of a base 0, because it's a warm season species, it's 220 growing degree days for Primo Max. If you have a new here from New Farm, I don't know if we have that yet, or if it's in Asia, or if you have it in the market, we found that one lasts a lot less, only 125 growing degree days. But again, same concepts. Higher rates led to higher levels of growth suppression. How much deeper is the suppression? Was it from the higher rate? So if our temperature is, say, if our high temperature was 20 and our low temperature is 12, and we apply our base of 10, that means the Primo is going to last about 36 days on a Bermuda grass putting green. The new will last about 20 days. But if our temperatures are, say, maybe a high of 36 and a low of 28, then we're only going to have 10 days suppression out of the Primo and 6 days suppression out of the new. A big trend right now for the Bermuda grass maintenance with Primo is, okay, we're going to use a low rate, like 1/4 of the labeled rate, so maybe 1 ounce per 1,000 of Primo on Bermuda grass. But then the idea is we're going to apply very frequently. So we're going to apply at a really high intensity, maybe if it's every 3 or 4 days. And I can show you how that can go wrong pretty quick. So here's an example of the amount of Primo in the plant. Let's say the average air temperatures are about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, so about 25, 26 degrees Celsius, and that's average again. So you have the high and the low, calculate the average. If we're applying every week, we notice that at that temperature, we see that there's even a slow amount of accumulation because we start with our 2 ounces in the plant, and after a week, about 1.1 ounces of that 2 has been gone. It's been degraded. It's been mowed off. Then I put 2 more ounces down, and then the next couple half-lives kick in. Now I lose another ounce. And so now you notice how it's slowly creeping up higher and higher? So my lower rate is turning in slowly to a higher rate. But it's so hot outside, it's not really that big of a deal because it happens to be that a 1-week application interval on a Primo at that rate, at that temperature, is not too unheard of. But if it were to be colder, say it was 70 or it was 60, what happens? So it's really cold. If you get into the edge of a season where the grass is starting to go dormant, and you stay in your summer intervals, you may, in the blue line, have only lost a half of a fluid ounce per acre of Primo, and then you add 2 more. And then you only lose a half of an ounce of that, and then you add 2 more, and you add 2 more, and all of a sudden we start stacking. Essentially, the grass is getting drunk on the PGR. Same thing that you're doing when you guys drink a little bit too much whiskey or beer or whatever. If you're applying that PGR faster than the grass is breaking it down, it's accumulating. Just like when you drink beer faster than your liver can break it down, you start to get drunk. That's what's going on here, and it can lead to some serious levels of clipping yield suppression. 95% clipping yield suppression. All elongation growth can stop if you use high enough rates of Primo, or even low rates of Primo, on too tight of an application interval. So I think that's kind of interesting. I think there's potential there for, we do know it increases green speed when you're on those really high intervals, but we might think there's an increase in disease. So Jim Kearns at NC State has been involved with the project because he thinks there's a correlation possibly there. And these weekly low rates, when it starts to get a little bit cooler, especially the ends of the season, they can lead to this overregulation. I think overregulation is actually fairly common. And the way that people think about overregulation, that you hear about the most is I went and used the wrong rate. Maybe you put a 10x rate down by accident because you did some math wrong. And then people call me up and they say, Bill, what should I do? And a lot of times, it might look bad for a little bit, but then the grass will break it down and they'll mow it off and it will recover. But we start to see a little bit too much suppression, a little overregulation, pushing that brake pedal just a little too hard when it starts to get cool and people stay on their summer intervals. Or on our collars and on our areas that already have longer intervals. So if we're spraying a green and the green's interval is 200 growing degree days for a Bermuda grass green, if your collar is 300 growing degree days, all of a sudden now you're over applying on your collars and you start to see this accumulation, this stacking, this increase in the amount of PGR in the plant. So we started doing some research to prove this. And again, this is proof of concept and it's in bentgrass, but it's same concepts apply to the Bermuda grass. I'll show an image of that at the end. So we applied a greens rate of Primo Max and Trim-It at greens intervals. We applied it to creeping bentgrass at fairway height turf. These typical rates and intervals will give us about 20 and 35% clipping yield suppression on a green. So not very much, just a nice level of suppression, usually to have good growth. Over time, then, this graph here is showing the clipping yield suppression, though, on this collar. And so instead of 20 and 35%, after one application, we're to 40 and 60% less clipping. So that's a big reduction. After a month of it, all of a sudden now we start seeing some of the discoloration in the Trim-It because now we're getting about 90% clipping yield suppression of the Trim-It versus 25% with the Primo. And then after 6 weeks, middle of June, when the season is just ramping up for us in Nebraska, the Trim-It is looking absolutely terrible. And the Primo's looking pretty bad too. And why is it? Because my clipping yields are so low that that plant cannot recover. It can't recover from the stress we're putting on, from mowing. It's just not growing. We're seeing diseases that are lasting and lingering as a result of that much clipping yield suppression. And it's pretty noticeable. It's kind of red squares. It looks pretty bad. So we tried some different treatments to try to recover from it. So some things we wanted to do. We just said, okay, if we're blocking too much of this gibberellin hormone, can we just add some? So let's add the hormone. Other things, we tried some other seaweed extracts that have different hormones in them. We tried to mask it with iron fertilizer. And then we just tried higher levels of nitrogen fertilizer. And why would this help? Because nitrogen fertilizer increases gibberellin. So we're going to increase that pathway and try to overwhelm the dam that is that plant growth regulator. And then we tried lowering mowing heights, thinking if we mow lower, then we're going to be able to mow it off faster and the grass will grow faster, more GA. So what did we find? This is what the plots looks like. A lot of different color diversity out there. But when it came to did it help or not, it really did. So we had no PGR. This is an area, no PGR looks just great. We have the PGR by itself, and it's really looking kind of discolored, hard to see from this picture with the contrast, but it's really, really brown and sunken. Then we have the PGR, no PGR with just the GA recovery treatment. And again, this is not that grass growing too fast. It's looking yellow and eventually got walloped with diseases. A lot of things like Pythium and brown patch just came in and killed in perfect squares. And then we had, though, the Trim-It with the GA, and it actually really did help with that overregulation. So if we had overregulation, a curative application of this might actually work. But notice the rate. This is 0.3 of a weight ounce per acre. And you're talking about grams of products to go out over a hectare. And if you go out too high of a rate, you'll get some really severe yellowing. So it really is your last resort. If you get to the point where your grass is so regulated you have to sod it out and put new sod down, I would try this. Otherwise, I'd be a little bit leery because just a little bit of this hormone can really cause a lot of elongation. Other things that worked, increasing nitrogen fertilizer, but you have to start that early. You can't just do it preventative. It really, or curatively. It really is a preventative thing. Maybe you just push fertilizer with the spray hawk, or a granular drop spreader in your collar to increase some growth there. Lowering mowing heights worked, and so can, it should say, washing off Class A's like Primo Max. Here's a picture of that from Matthew Wharton at Carolina Golf Club in the U.S., in North Carolina. We can see that he's applying to his bentgrass greens, and his collars are Bermuda grass, and he's getting a lot of decline from all the Primo going onto those collars. So he has a guy come out and starts to wash it off, and the collars are remarkably better because he's actually washing the PGR off the leaf because Primo is absorbed by the leaf. So if you wash it off the leaf, you get less PGR in the plant. And so that was one thing that worked for him. I think one thing that really can help with this, and we're doing a lot of research on it this year, are these variable rate sprayers. So if we have a sprayer, one thing you can do is turn the sprayer boom off before it gets to your cleanup passes or to your collar, so that you're trying to minimize the PGR. You might think, okay, Bill, I need to spray, and I have other products in the tank. Yeah, that's going to limit this type of application. So that's where some of these like GPS sprayers and these injections of PGRs really hold some promise. So as you're out spraying along and you get to the edge of the green, those nozzles start turning off. They're hanging off the green. Or even better, we can use our Greenkeeper app to tell you how much PGR is gone, and instead of just turning the PGR off altogether, we can use lower rates of the PGR. And so maybe your collar gets a lower rate than your green, because the rate impacts the amount of suppression, right? So if we're getting too much suppression, put less rate down. If we're getting too little, put more rate down. I think this technology will really help out with that. So to kind of wrap up today, then, let's talk about the speedometer. And you're going to hear a lot more about this afternoon, right? I'm sure. So I don't want to steal too much thunder about clipping collection, but I think it's something that we're really starting to really advocate for. And again, it's something Mike has been advocating for a long time too. To know is to measure. We have to know what our clipping yields are if we're trying to manage them effectively. So this is from Micah. He sent it to us to kind of help have an indication of how do we do clipping yields, and what does this number mean? We were talking yesterday about, at first, we're like, why would you do this? Clipping volume really doesn't mean anything. But then he started looking at the data and looking at clipping volume, comparing it to clipping weight, and finding that they're pretty correlated together, as you would assume. If you have more volume of something, you're probably going to have more weight of it, right? I mean, you're not going to have more volume and it's going to weigh the same. That would be kind of odd, right? Potentially there's some reasons for some outliers here, but what they noticed is that the Bent and the Champion, had a real nice 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 type of a correlation going on. So from that, then, we can say, all right, if we know what our clipping volumes are, and we know how much nutrients in the plant, now when we're figuring out how much fertilizer to apply, I kind of have a way to judge how much I'm taking off, right? If removal of fertilizer is a big part of how much we have to apply, then we should be knowing what we're taking off. And clipping yield is giving us a good metric to try to look at that. So, again, what's the optimum number? It's a question that we're working on answering. Again, I have some theories I want to test out this summer, and I'm really excited. This is my last extension conference of long travel, more than a car, for the year. So this is a great way to end it here in Thailand, so thanks again for inviting me. But I'm excited to go back into the research and onto the farm and just test some of these concepts out. This is some actual research from a golf course in the center part of the U.S. And in this one, we just took all the clippings and we just looked at them cumulatively. So we added them all together. And we wanted to get an idea of what was the growth rate over the course of the year. And so one thing you'll notice here too is look at our clipping yields. Again, for a cool season species in the center of the country, it grew immediately after it greens up. We always see this. It always explodes out of the ground. And then when it should be pretty conducive for grass to grow, it actually slows down. Then we get that big mineralization effect. So we get organic matter in the soil becoming released. And now it's starting to grow like crazy in the middle of summer. And then as the fall comes and it starts to slow down. And so we can look at individual greens. We have all 18 greens displayed here. Maybe it's a little overwhelming. So we average them all together and kind of get an idea of what the average is looking like. And now if we know what the average clipping volume is, and we use Micah's work to show how clipping volume is related to clipping weight, we can start to figure out how much nutrient did I take away. And so when I look at this data then, I look at the cumulative amount of clippings that we removed, and I figured out how much is there, we see that this course removed about 2.4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet last year. How much did they put down? 1.5 pounds. So they put down 40% less than they removed. How sustainable is that, right? The soil bank account is getting them through that deficit this year. But over time, you might need to increase higher and higher levels of nitrogen to at least be accounting for what's being removed. And you don't have to, you can do it in Excel. Jason Haynes at Pender Harbor in British Columbia, Canada, he must be a computer programmer on the side, it seems like. He's doing all this in Google Sheets, pretty cool things, where he can just go in and enter in his clipping volumes, his clipping weights, his green speeds, his soil moisture. He's got growth potential model for temperature right in there. And so his heads-up display, you can just look at it quickly. Instead of being overwhelmed by charts like this, he has a display that just says, how's my clipping yield today? Is it high or is it low? And then an estimate of how much nutrient is in that clipping yield to figure out, is he getting close to matching what he's removing? So I know most of you aren't web designers or computer programmers, and so one thing that we've been working on over the last 3.5 years now is building an app that we can use to track all this data. The first thing we used it for was for PGR applications. We needed a tool that we could put all of those 47,000 data points of clipping yield data into so that you could quickly use this app and know how to use the PGRs on your golf course. But we've expanded it now, where we have disease models, but now we're also tracking things like clipping volume and things like soil moisture, green speed, surface firmness, all the things that you guys collect but just don't write down right now. It's one thing to collect it and look at the number, but it's a lot more powerful to collect it, write it down, and then use it for some type of an interpretation. So this is what we're developing this app for. So what does it do? It tracks product applications, and it gives you mixing instructions. So if you are mixing, and you need to keep track of those applications, and you have to know how much product or fertilizer need to go into your spray tank, this does the math for you. And so we have a metric version we just launched that you can use for the sprayer math. And then it keeps all those areas, all those records stored. So if you need to report them to anybody, like a government official or something, you could easily just give it to them. It tracks the growing degree days. And it does it from weather data from Weather Underground. So you can go get a weather station for like $150 US or less. And you can put it on your golf course. You can hook it up through Wi-Fi to Weather Underground. And you can see real time what are the weather conditions at your course. Then I can pay Weather Underground $8,000 a year to use that data and give it back to you for free in Greenkeeper and use that weather data from your course to then drive your growing degree day models. So if you wanted to use growing degree day models to figure out your applications, you can use your own course's weather data to drive those models. We also now track fertilizers. So we have different fertilizers. We can track the different nutrients. If I had to ask many of you how much iron you put down in actual pounds or kilograms or grams or whatever of iron per whatever unit, I bet most of you couldn't do it for last year. I put down iron. Some of you will say grams per a product. Some might say grams per 1,000. Some might just say, I put some iron in the tank every time I spray and have no idea. Well, now we can start tracking those types of additions so we know what product we're using so we can become more precise in those applications. We've integrated with a soil, water, and testing lab. So now we can look at how did you fertilize and then monitor how things are changing so that we can start to dial in those fertilizers. And that's the lab we use has got international permits, so they can receive samples from Asia. Some crowdsourced pest reporting, multiple users can be added. There's a lot of different ways to use this app. It is a global app. This is a chart from the US. This is actually an old figure now. There's about 4,900 different user emails on our site. 3,500 different golf courses in the last 2 years. So people are starting to use it and to embrace it. We've tracked out 49,000 different products over the last 2 years. So it's not the most sexy site in the world, doesn't look really flashy, but you log in and it has all the information you need to manage your course. So we have our growing degree days and our other applications here for our greens. We can see our fertility, we can see the weather forecast, the radar, the 10-day forecast, all from Weather Underground, disease models. And when you're ready to make an application, it's real simple. You just pick, like, I want to treat my greens today. I want to pick the sprayer I want to use. It then knows, because it knows the area of your greens, the size of your sprayer. You enter that the first time you sign up. You know you need like 1.77 tanks, how many gallons or now liters that you need. And then you put in your different products. So you can pick, say, a PGR like a New or Primo Max. You put the rate you want to use, and then it tells you how many growing degree days you need to use for your interval. So the rate doesn't have a huge effect on this, but it has some, and so the greenkeeper knows all those models. And then you push save, and you get a nice little printout that has all the information that you can give to someone to mix up their sprayer and spray and have peace of mind that they didn't mess up the mixing math. Then when you log in, say we applied Primo here to our teas, it tells me the day I applied, the day that it's going to expire based on the weather forecast, how many growing degree days have been accumulated, and again, it's going to use a base 0 or a base 10 depending on the species. So it knows if, when you set it up, like if my greens are Bermuda grass, it knows it's going to use Bermuda grass greens, it's going to use a base of 10. And then it tells you my relative clipping yield. So right now I'm getting 34% clipping yield suppression out of it. As these products wear off, they're going to go change color, and then when they're gone, you can just close them down and say that they're gone. One thing we just launched is the soil testing feature. Yeah, I got it. Thanks. And it's going to have its ability for you just to pick your different areas, the soil test that you want. You can put on a map where your location is, and then it gives you a label you send off to the lab. We give you the permits required for the U.S., and then your results get piped directly into Greenkeeper. And so now we can start to graph them and figure out, are your soil levels going up or down? And then we can reference that to your clipping volume and to your fertility records to tell you, how are you under or over applying for different nutrients. So that's kind of what it looks like. So here's an example where we have soils that were fertilized over the last 5 years, and we have potassium increased and then a decrease. This is from Real Golf Course. Look at their records. Well, they were putting a lot of potassium down for a couple of years, and then they decided, I don't want to put any potassium down, and so we start to see it go down. So if they wanted to keep it at, say, 80 parts per million, they need to put a little bit more potassium in their fertilizer program to try to keep that around 80 so it doesn't continue to go down. Phosphorus, calcium, any nutrient that they test for, you can look at graphically like this. And the thing we're launching this week is this performance tracker. So if you want to get involved in really trying to do your tracking of your clipping yields, clipping volumes, if you want to track green speed or color, you can use this app for it. And the cool thing is you can add your crew members to it. So if they have a smartphone, if they're on a green, they can pull their phone out, they put it in a clipping volume, they push send, and then they close their phone, and they're done. And now you have all that data entered for you. So you can have all it there. You don't have to write it down or do anything. It goes right into the app. We're doing some active ingredient inventory tracking. How much does that application cost you? If you have a GPS sprayer, that's being added. And educational resources from me and Doug Soldat, my partner with this company. So just, again, it's a free app. There's a premium version, but if it's a free app, if it's something you want to give a try, just sign up. It's at greenkeeperapp.com. It's a web-based app, so you don't download it. You just go to the website, greenkeeperapp.com, and sign up for free. So I'm going to wrap up here with this slide. How do we manage our turfgrass growth? There's a lot of different factors out there. There's things we really can't control, and that's really kind of the gear or in the car. Are we in first gear or are we in fifth gear? It's going to be really important to know what kind of response I'm going to see out of my fertilizer. If I'm in first gear, I'm not going to see a big, huge clipping yield response because I'm limited by other environmental factors. There's other times, though, where the soil might be giving us a lot of fertilizer in the middle of the summer from mineralization. And, maybe I need less fertilizer. The grass is still growing like crazy. I start using my PGRs to pump the brake. If the grass is growing slow, maybe I use the PGR at the low label rate to give me all those plant health benefits. But when the grass is starting to really take off and it's growing too fast, then I can start dialing my application rate to start to reduce that clipping yield. And ultimately, just monitor clipping yield. It's so important, and it's so pretty easy to do. Relative to all the time that we waste taking care of random things on golf courses, it should be a priority for us to monitor how much clippings we're getting so that we can start to become better in applying our nitrogen fertilizer and adjusting our PGR rates based on what our clipping yield is telling us. So that's all I have for you guys today. I rushed through a lot. I'm really sorry if it was too fast. I'm a very fast talker, so this is me talking slow as it is, so I apologize. If you're interested in any of this stuff, I'd encourage you to try to connect with our program. Our website is turf.unl for the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, unl.edu, or follow us on Twitter. I'm at UNLTurf, pretty simple, and give me a follow from that. My email is here, wkreuser2@unl.edu. Emails, I'd be happy to answer any emails that you might have, and look forward to communicating with you over the next 2 days. So with that, I just want to say thank you, and I think we'll do questions and answers at 4 o'clock today. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bill Gaines, for sharing us their interesting information and research. So this time, lunch? Oh,
before lunch, we're going to take a break for lunch, and shortly, we would like to do a group photo, if that's possible, up front here, before lunch. So if we could have everybody just come on up. We'll try to do the best we can with grouping everybody. And then after that, we'll go to lunch. And we'll come back at 1 o'clock, as close as we can to 1 o'clock. Our next speaker is Andrew McDaniel from Kia Golf Club. He'll be up next. So please come on up to take a group photo.
For overruns, already prepare at the Superlight A, the right-hand side of these rooms. You have to prepare your blue coupon for your lunch.
All right, come on up, guys, for a photo. All right, everybody hold still for a few minutes. Right in front. Can we have a like, please? Like.
Wow, very good moment with our friends.
Thank you.
We also thank you again for the stage set up from the Sport Authority of Thailand. We have a good organized for arts today. ต้องขอขอบคุณการกีฬาแห่งประเทศไทย